really, this session is about just gathering your initial feedback on your first look at these templates, whether they made sense, what feedback you might offer. Please put that in the Google Doc I already told you about, but we'd love to just hear it now too. And Kim, I think you're supposed to be moderating this, not me, but if you want to, you can.
Can I read that? Because it's easy to understand. We always, of course, we always are thinking once we get little detail, but I think there, for the example of financial chemical, I think it's really good. And it's clear. But we always think we take things for granted. Love to see my colleagues that want to ask me questions. Imagine that my colleagues are doing the financial chemical. Especially they'll always imagine that are zoologists or taxonomists, which answers are going to ask me. So I think that's the real test to sweep, pop up, me looking at the soil plankton data. I think that's going to be the most interesting one.
Yeah, whatever we visited today, be sure to visit the other ones tomorrow morning.
I think one of the big comments we had was that perhaps we had some a relaxed criteria around the required metadata or the recommended relaxed going back. So if you had data from 1992 or 1979, you had to the requirements for that metadata were much reduced. In fact, we recommended only 3 or 4 per parameter, but going forward, that it then becomes kind of stricter of what's required or recommended.
Online also.
Yeah, maybe Rick can speak to, I think one of the revelations that we came up with is you can get as granular, as a community, we can get as granular as we want to go, but we should determine what that is to be able to, you know, all have that sort of recommended versus, you know, required, or what we feel is required as a community. But and how we organize that in a way that's really accessible and kind of consumable for whoever will be filling it out. That's both a nod to the project data managers that are working on the data before they submit it to a repository, and the repositories themselves. There's one other piece of that I wanted to say, and that granularity kind of boils down to what we were discussing of what we consider an event versus an activity versus, you know, what is the lens that we're looking through when we build these out as a time series community.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like just like basically merging the science mind with the data management. I think that's the key, because, you know, like some of the, you know, granularity that Pierre was, you know, like emphasizing, that's important in a perspective of like data management. Sometimes when we put the data as a submission, like it's there, but it's so mixed up that then it's more complicated later on to actually find or correlate like as a time series. So I think it was a very useful conversation to how basically better map out all the data and how to put like specific details, as someone said just like a moment ago, like very detailed information moving forward, even though we cannot go in the past and just like find out details about the past that we cannot go back.
Also, continuing from that theme, so I am still used to be more scientist. So, you know, biochemistry, then microbial ecology, etc. So, you know, I have that scientific mind. But then one thing I realized as I moved into the data world, the data architecture, etc., you have to choose what. It's more like which scientific mind you deploy. As the data generator, you want to save time and just get it done and then publish your paper. But then as the scientist who's looking and trying to find data, you really wish the other scientist added some more metadata, right? So you have to think about which science when, right? That's important, because then you really wish somebody actually wrote down the name of the action, the methodology, the link, etc. then using both of those, you're getting closer to the data manager's mind because they're trying to cover multiple vectors of access to the data, from the generator to the user to the reuser to the application developer. And one thing that we have been working on in Otis, but also Marco Polo, this European project for biodiversity that we're on, is taking really big spreadsheets like the ones that you have and splitting them up to match the kinds of things that Otis and other systems talk about. So the events, the actions, the projects, the people, the organizations, each one has their own little spreadsheet. We tried this with the particulate flux, and it seems to work pretty well. But again, let's have that not interfere with your process now to talk about what you want to talk about. We'll do that later when we sort of parse through those and then separate them out, which will then allow people to develop better field information management systems, allow LIMS, FIMS, other systems that you need. And as I think Bruce said it very well, the minds converge, and then it should just feel natural.
We talked a little bit about future-proofing it, how some methods that we're using now are not going to be probably what we're using in 10 years' time, and how you might accommodate that within the metadata templates. Like if you're using pull-down lists, for example, you know, they're going to probably fast come out of, they'll become obsolete.
I mean, I guess as a related point of that is, and we didn't really talk about this, but it just made me think while you were mentioning that, is who keeps those lists up to date, like having pulled down lists. So, you know, those things going forward, you know, if that is the way you're going, those things going forward have to be pretty carefully managed, because you know, what you don't want as a data provider is to go to the thing and then suddenly find that, you know, there's no way of recording that, because that's going to immediately just be a barrier or effort that you don't want to have to, engage with. So I think it's as important that those drop downs are kept up to date and relevant as you know, as a scientific data provider. There's nothing worse than going to data finding 7 drop downs and the body what's not there, right? Because then the email to someone that, oh right, okay, blah blah, and it's just another barrier to providing that data. I'll say I got an answer to that, by the way. It's just
It's sort of interesting because, like, again, in Ocean Info Hub, which is like a generic interface to Otis, there can be more. The dropdowns are basically generated automatically by the metadata being shared by our federation, right? So we just say whatever's being shared, and if it matches the right property, add it to the list. If you then had a portal, again, that has a more restrictive view on what's being shared in your community, then if any one of your data, like your trusted people in your network, adds another parameter, it'll automatically show up. Okay, right? That could be a way to do it with minimal overheads, minimal emails, right? But again, the important part is having the trusted managers of that flow, so that you know you're not going to get jumped.
Yeah.
So one of the key things on that is with that list, come, go, die, come back. And one of the key things that is to figure out the coverage that's working on those was mechanism. So terms get applicated, new term comes in, which has the accurate description, but then still there's a point difference also means that information that was originally there is not lost. As you go back in time and see the these applications and cutting that, and it gives you not quite a lot of problems, but that understanding of what that function actually is problem.
I think that speaks to the question, like a question we had earlier on. I think it was a question to Nico, like what's special about time series data? Again, nothing very special, sorry, but there are things that are worth emphasizing. And what you mentioned, obsolescence strategies, deprecation technology, it exists, but many systems kind of don't really think about it too much. But in your case, with a historical view on things, those definitely have to be there. So obsolescence and deprecation measures to manage information.
So the goal of these templates then that we're working on now, these will then be, you know, ideally what we use as a time series community, correct? That's the goal of this. And so then the templates we're working on now are measurements that are commonly taken across lots of different time series, but it's not covering every single thing.
Right.
So is the goal then just to create templates for the commonly used ones right now? And if that's the case, then going forward, when other methods start becoming more commonly used and we don't have a template for, has there been talk or ideas about then what's the future mechanisms for creating new templates then? Instead of having to have a meeting like this every 10 years, is there a better way of creating new templates as we go forward for new methods with, with all the community input?
I mean, ideally, that's the hope.
Mhm.
I mean, we have to start with, we've started with a small core set of biological variables that we know a lot of time series measured.
Mhm.
Most of them aren't even biological EOVs by Goose standards.
Okay.
They're very unique to time series. We have created what we've created here to start to get our house in order. But I think we do need to build a culture of, once we set that example, being able to build on that example and expand out and develop additional templates.
Right.
But that's on us.
I would also say there's value in keeping the network together in terms of somebody comes up with a new template, but distributing that and
Share it.
socializing that across all the time series to kind of maximize the utility and value of that is also something that should be like undervalued, right? So maybe there is still value in getting together every so often and share what's changing among all these disparate. I know that other time series do that, the LTRs do that. And
That's the thing. If I had my way, I would have us meeting every 3 years to share this kind of information.
Don't worry, we don't really get to do it anymore.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that's not gonna be probably feasible. And so what's the way of then continuing this effort with, without the need to have everyone in the same room?
I think if we became a goose, or whatever, then you'd have a steering group and that sort of thing. You might have a group of people who would take some responsibility of organising that process, a little bit like what's done with the EOV spec sheets, for example.
I mean, having been in multiple Goose processes, including EOB spec sheet development, don't count on it, right? It's possible, because if you all are part of a Goose network, then if you get regional funding from any one of your regional funders, you can say, well, part of that funding, we're going to convene the Goose panel on X, right? That's doable because the funder is interested in that. They say, okay, that increases our regional visibility by contributing. So under that sort of flag, I would imagine it would happen. To the other point, I think what we worked on a little bit in our group might help with this, because what I would envisage, these big spreadsheets you have right now, when it comes to like more effective management of that, we would start splitting out the content into the properties that go to data sets, the properties that go to methods, the properties that go to whatever. I would imagine every time series station or time series organization here would keep their own catalog of the variables they measure, the methods they use, etc. They keep that. If that then talks to Otis, as we would expect, like each one is a node in Otis, then you automatically do the overlap, right? And you say, okay, this is our minimal set just because we seem to be measuring it. You can do that overlap by, let's say, the NERC term very precisely, or general textual matches, like fuzzy matching on text. Say we're close, let's then have a focus meeting here to seal the deal and get that as our minimum spec. And then if people add or remove methods, you detect that every time you refresh your metadata file. And then you already know what to talk about without having to go through the whole process again. You know, in a focus sense, what to do, and that could be a teleconference, right? If you can't manage to meet in person.
That makes a lot of sense.
And from the perspective of taking a stab at this, on your own. Yeah, Otis has a cookbook on.
Well, it has a book on just generally how to do it. But again, what I'm learning in this meeting, basically, if your community decides, yes, we're going to lead the way in terms of ecological time series station, and we're going to agree on the templates, etc. We will work with you, and then we'll publish them as UNESCO guidance when it comes to it, so that other time series stations know that we can do it that way too. And that is agreeing, right? I mean, again, as Justin said, and also others, technically we can do this now. It's more a question as, do we have the champions from the user side and the developers, code developer side? No, we can do the other stuff, right?
Thanks.
Any comments? Anyone online?
Very
Enrique?
quickly, I'm thinking about the required fields, and, if you go into Ovis or. I don't know, things like eco-tax, are these open platforms, repositories where people can publish their data? They have an enormous list of fields that you can add to your metadata, but usually the required fields are just a handful, maybe 2 or 5. And that's really encouraging if you're coming in as a newcomer and you want to start sharing your data or even learning how to publish your data in these repositories. So I think we as a community should think about what those minimum set of requirements really need to be. And this is especially important for new time series that may be starting in Africa, in South America, Central America, where it is really difficult to sometimes report technical details to the level of our satisfaction, or at least in this conversation. So for these different parameters that we're looking at, chlorophyll, mesozooplankton, we need to think hard about, okay, what's the minimum that we really need people to report on, and what's not exactly necessary.
I saw Charlotte, and then I saw Tom, and then I saw Phil.
Just to follow on, in our group, we were talking a lot about a lot of things, but at the end, we sort of decided, well, Tom mentioned the first question that every PI is sort of asking is, where does my data want to go from here? So in the world where we have all the funding, maybe we can have like a checkbox. So if you're thinking you want to also send to Ocean Sites and Otis and blah, blah, and like all of them, then you have your minimum requirements based on what is needed to send to those areas. We also talked about how you need to talk to a data center about where they also disseminate data. But having more of an attractive carrot for PIs based on data sharing potentially or visibility and output might be more helpful for next data submission.
Tom had something. But I think like, this is, we're thinking something similar for that bioeco portal, the EOV portal that will be based on top of those, right? They're not compliant to that degree, but they are sharing microbial diversity, birds and turtle diversity, etc. And we don't want to ignore that. So the portal that's going to be pulling this data is going to have like multiple tiers. One tier is that you are sharing data about those things. That's already useful. So a new time series that's just sharing name, description, and a link, right? That's something you get in the portal. We're not going to exclude you. You're in the portal. Then you kind of, again, have filters on top of that to say the more compliant you are with this gold standard, then you get a little or filtered set. So again, it's inclusive as a digital platform, but you do reward compliance with, let's say, global frameworks as they emerge. And the best outcome would be you diversify your governance committee so that you have, let's say, the minimal global gold standard, and then one for the Atlantic, one for this region, because there are different people you have to report to, or different frameworks. And that's doable because it's the same metadata flow. You're just marking mandatory on different things for different delivery things. The worst, well, the old way is that you build a new data stream for each one of those consumers. That's really inefficient, very expensive, and very brittle, right? But if you have one data stream with like different requirements, different filters, that's modern light, doesn't take much.
And to follow on to that, and what I thought you were gonna say here is,
Sorry.
play a little devil's advocate here, and rather than try and constrain yourselves to what's the minimum we can all agree on, like maybe think in the context of the sky's the limit, even if we can't get to this larger corpus, what would we wish to have, even if not everybody's going to hit that, and then realize that not everybody's not necessarily going to be compliant or non-compliant, but not everybody is going to meet this larger standard or larger agreed content. And you won't ever hit it for the historical or legacy content. but going forward, this is what we're aiming or aspiring for. And you may or may not have the capacity to get there, but what would you want if you could have it all?
And-
And then realize that some
Yeah.
folks will reach it and some folks won't.
And think about that also strategically, right? Because if you have an agreement, and if we document that in the IOC portals and everything about like where we want to go in the future, that's something you can communicate in your next project proposal, saying our current status is 50% of this, we need to finish it. And then you have a rational basis to ask for that funding.
Yeah, I think that's really important actually, in terms of, often time series get started with on a shoestring, right? You might have, so you might be meeting all those standards. What you definitely don't want is someone in the data world saying, oh, this doesn't meet all our standards, so it's not good enough, so we don't want it. That's exactly the wrong kind of message we want to be delivering. What we want to say is, we've got this data, it's been accepted as valuable, but we need, as you say, we need more funding to hit these gold world standards to make it a prominent world leading time series. That's the kind of message that we need. So I'm quite in favor of keeping the essential variables quite small with the appropriate flags that this doesn't hit the gold standard. Because I worry that otherwise, if you can't do the gold standard, someone's going to turn around and say, no, we're not going to do it all, right?
I was just gonna say, in terms of sort of the LTR experience, when we started using EML, nobody had sort of a full suite, nobody covered attributes, et cetera. And what we did was actually have a committee sit down and say, okay, look, what's a reasonable level 1? What's a reasonable level 2? And then what you could do is you could put in your annual report, we now serve level 2 metadata. And eventually got to the point where everybody served level 5 metadata and we didn't worry about it anymore. But it is a good idea not to make it so that everybody decides what their own level 1 is and their own level 2 is. It's helpful to have sort of some group think about what are reasonable steps along the way, so that you can communicate efficiently about what level you have achieved.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a similar effort in IOC and ID, like their quality management framework, the global one, right? And of course, quality means different things to different people. We recognize this. But what we've also learned is that the more you can actually unpack that quality flag, because if somebody says, well, we consider a quality that's been calibrated in the last 2 months, right? Well, why not have the metadata that tells you it's been calibrated in the next 2 months? Then you don't have to rely on an abstraction of the score, right? So that's helping us farm out things that, it takes some time. But otherwise, yes, it is useful to talk about that, but also to split it up and say, what makes that quality, and can we actually externalize it in the metadata rather than relying on some number, right? Not to say that you shouldn't do it. It's just that you can also just break it apart, and it'll be more useful through more vectors.
But I kind of like a lot of what I'm hearing, and as a data provider, and coming from that angle, I think it might get a lot of traction about kind of combining two of these ideas. One being, what's my motivation for putting data into a data repository in the first? Probably my program manager told me that I needed to do it, right? So I want to know which one I'm getting when I do a certain subset of metadata, which redistribution point can I get to by doing that, right? I can check those boxes. I can show that I've done what I'm supposed to do with my data. And the second one is, how compliant am I with some national or international standards? So am I at level 3 in the Otis Goose hierarchy? That's good, but I can get to level 4, that's better, right? So I think these two ideas work pretty well as motivation for the data provider. And it's worth thinking about that in terms of architecting, like what's a minimum standard, or what redistribution portals can I be compliant with if I have these certain subsets of metadata that I provide. That's a lot different angle than saying, here's a 350 row thing that I want you to fill in. Like, why am I doing that? Right? It's the motivation for it, I think, has to be part of it.
But sometimes motivation doesn't come from your data management because you don't have it. Sometimes I think we need to think as a community on that. is we pull out as a community and agree methodology, and we need to submit the data and the metadata, we make it stronger and our decision makers and some data managers might get involved. Sometimes it's the opposite, mostly in the southern part of the world. We are pushing into getting the data because the motivation for us is the continuation because we want to have scientific data. But data management doesn't care. For example, in my institute, we cover the whole Argentine platform, but they don't care about the data we are collecting. Why we are still collecting? Because we do think it's important. That's it. It's not because somebody's asking me for submitting data. It's my responsibility because I'm responsible for the time series. For the time being, hopefully younger people and more charitable are gonna come after me, but for the last time, it's my responsibility. I think it shouldn't be a discussion again, you know? It's because we need to.
In terms of sort of the evolution, one of the things is that it's very difficult to coalesce around nothing. Once you have something inadequate or adequate, some starting point, then you can start to develop tools that work with that. You can start to develop tools that take what you produce and provide additional value. But you have to sort of have that starting core, and I think that's really what the template constitutes, is a place where you can start worrying about, well, let's make better tools for populating the templates, and now let's make better tools that use the template to produce useful products. But as long as it's sort of, you know, the two are separated and you don't have that link, you're out of line.
Yeah, but I mean, if the community is waiting for, that's what happens with CO2, like SOCAR, like. As a community, we decide that this is what we need, and we follow that. And it encourages other centers, other people to do it, so I think it needs to be those ways, you know? It's multi-directional.
Yes, and then also connecting to that sort of why are we doing it statement, right? We have the tools and the templates and we figure that out, and we figure out the link, again, as I presented, the member states of IOC have encouraged all research and other institutes to share data over Otis. It's now a decision at that level. So we have a why that can be communicated to funders too, that, you know, in terms of global compliance and in aid of the UN Ocean Decade, this is the plan. When the implementation plan comes out, which I will finish this week, it will also basically say, I was very reluctant to sort of say, please connect to Otis because I'm the chair of Otis. But then the other members of the implementation plan, right, I think the other 20 or so members said, there's nothing else that's going to fly at this point in the last 5 years of the decade. This will work. We know it works. We've confirmed that it works. So it's going to be in there, right? So we have it. So we have the why, we have the listening. We have many systems that are already connected. So we have expertise in this community already. The rest is just making sure everyone is able to say what they want to say. And then we check that we hear it properly. And then you can point to that as a sort of short-term success out of this. And again, start now, start small. It doesn't matter if it's small, you can grow from there, right?
I wonder how should we navigate among all different, there are quite a few already that we're managing. Both has UNS, SDG, now there's a new one. Things in different tools. We finally got our things ready with Canadian and I use. And we've been using DODC code for everything. And in the past, when we were only submitting to one website, okay, the person in charge was going through everything and make sure that the comments were right and all that. Now we're dealing with 3 or 4 different websites. All of a sudden, we needed one more person to deal with all these. And it's so me as a data provider, this is a huge overhead. I don't know how to deal with it. You all have different systems. It's hard to put all together, but should we work with other templates to make sure there's only very minimal difference among them. So is it deal all has templates? In comparison.
So I can directly respond to that. Subject to be permitted.
You talked about.
So for who's the release, is for oxygen and for carbon permitted, there are, similar activities going on than such templates. And the OHAS template is, particularly used as a basis, I think it's both. And at least for those two, actually I'm involved in those as well, so what I'll try is to incorporate what I gather from here with them. So that ideally, these templates should be the same, right? You shouldn't need to have a different template necessarily, a completely different template for the DSC submission to request, then we decide here for this time system. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have some extra fields here or there. It just should be the same field with different names. So it's more this block.
And that block approach, I mean, I think, remember that sort of like layer thing that I showed you, like from the computer up to the whatever. It's important to remember that the expert community is defining what you want. You're defining content. You're defining the really, really high level stuff. That's something that the data folks among us can take and make sure it's compliant to things like schema and things like JSON-LD. Because ultimately you will be talking about those things. You will have cruises that are events. You will have actions like sampling. You'll have all of those things. We would then farm it out so that it matches that standard, not our standard. Again, Otis doesn't have any Otis standards. We use global standards. What we help the ocean community do is translate what they're trying to say in terms of content into the form that systems will understand. And going through the particulate matter, I think it will be quite similar. Nico, we've gone through the carbon and the oxygen stuff too for us. We can parse through that, which is generated by scientists who are worried about the content. But what you will see happen is that a lot of the names that you're calling things can probably be matched with things that already exist, maybe not perfectly, but it's going to get us like 80–90% of the and actually build something, as opposed to having another 5–10 years writing papers at each other, hoping for the best, right? So I think that's what's going to help us here, because you can develop, this is the house in order sort of thing. You develop whatever technology works for your community, but what you push out to the world should be intelligible to the other system out there, right? So decoupling the data conformance to any software conformance or method conformance things.
So that's the same thing I was saying we thought of
Yeah.
EML as an exchange format, not as a data system. It's turned out to be a whole lot more useful than we thought it was gonna be.
But I think it's, I hear the pain that you're talking about, and I think that you can't sort of wait for the wave of tech to help. It would be really helpful for the tech side of the house to understand what the drivers are for submitting all of these. And maybe it's that coordination isn't happening behind the scenes, but it would be really interesting to hear what's driving you to submit. Is it a funder requirement? Is it your own project visibility? Is it, where are the disconnects between these communities on who's asking for this information too? I think that would be really educational.
I think maybe there's an issue here with, especially with time series. I can see potentially there's an issue with kind of motivation of people who are actually making the data versus making the data available. So there's people in the time series community, I'm not going to name them, but there's people who have spent their entire life and their whole careers off individual time series, right? And they are incredibly personally successful. And that's, but their motivation is they really, really care about one thing, right? It's this particular type of particular bunch of measurements. Now, I'm not saying they're not closed off necessarily to sharing that data. They are happy to share that data, but maybe their capacity for going through all this stuff is because they're not globally focused on how this might be used as part of a big coordinated network, their motivation might be less than it would be for someone who's got it. So I guess the point I'm making is, maybe about badly, is that there might be a kind of motivation mismatch there, right? They might be like, well, this works really well for me, but they don't necessarily see that, because they've been very successful in the one individual thing, they don't necessarily see the value of that sort of wider that community.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And, you know, I can turn that around in a little bit of a sharper way. There are people who hoard data, you know, and they will release it when they have a publication, usually a high impact publication.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they will not share it, which is a sort of not a good use of public funds. It's publicly funded, right? But right now, if we start federating, if the community says, look, this is the data that's available, Otis, as I mentioned, will be used as a sort of state of ocean data reporting structure, right? I could imagine any community like this one publishing their own sort of sub-state, right? This is the state of the available data. And then the gaps will be apparent, right? For those people who are, or organizations that are hoarding, that are kind of too tuned into the economy of academia and not of observations. Again, if you're thinking about Goose membership, remember Goose is operational. It's not research only. It's operational networks. They want that data out there. So reconciling that, having those difficult conversations is necessary, and it's necessary to do that transparently. And if somebody says, no, look, I need my papers to fund my program, that's fine. That's a pluralistic world. We live in it, right? But that has to be clear. What we've seen before is that people try to interfere with the development of open data systems, which we'll talk about, I guess, tomorrow and others, right? Open data, etc. In order to protect their, let's say, scientific economic interests with impact factors, etc. Once you get it out in the open, say, okay, if you want to do that, that's your prerogative, as long as your funder is happy with that. We can't do that, but we will show the discrepancy, because that's how we develop as a global community.
Quickly going back to the multiple websites, the student data. I mean, over the years at Max, I can't tell you how many requests to get the data. I want to build this website, I want to build this website, I want this format, this format. And it's a lot of effort, and as Angel says, we don't really have data managers, and we are two of the largest consumer programs. For us, we now simply submit everything that we could do, organize it. You want to data, or data, you have to stream, and that's a very simplified way for us to go to data. We will talk directly to people doing data managers, and we have been working with them quite intensely the past 2 years. And now we have a pipeline with data flows, that's what streaming. So I feel like if you're a data provider, you should provide to one data assembly center. And the data assembly center should be responsible for distributing to the students.
Yeah. In terms of the architecture that we're aiming for in the decade, that's what we plan, right? Like it's a digital ecosystem, and therefore organizations and people have different niches in this ecosystem, right? Some are the data generators, some are the data brokers, mediators, etc. Bad things happen when you try to inhabit a niche that you're not equipped to inhabit, right? You start to be outcompeted and you waste energy. So that's a great relationship. If you found a trusted data broker that feeds forward into the systems that you need to, fantastic, right? And then you can diversify from there.
I like that model, but I would just point out that there are data providers who cannot find a single repository that will serve their needs, and so it might not be 2 or 3, it might be 6 or 8. You know, it's like, because if you're creating a diverse types of data, you're not going to find that one-stop shop. So I think we need to recognize that that's. I mean, I like the model, I really do. But it's not going to be quite that simple for everyone.
Sure, and we thought up with our but you know, ocean sites, they've tried a strategy for the last 20 years. And they have built data assembly centers distributed.
So we're working with ocean sites, we're working with Metadata, we're working with SoCat, we're working with, you know, IU, so it just goes on and on, right? It's not. Anyway, I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm just saying it's not a simple like boom solve. There's a lot of.
But that's that coordination thing. Again, right?
Yeah.
I use Nicodemo, their Otis nodes, right now they're getting aware at the mediator level that they exist and whose data they're handling, right? Then they need to know at the product and application level, who's going to consume our stuff? What format do they want to do, right? Once they do that and then document, hey, we have the capacity to convert into these formats and these semantics. And that's an Otis, then everyone knows who's doing what. And we know where the gaps are, and the mediators can talk to each other to figure out how to fill that, or if there are redundancies, how to prevent that, right?
And I'll just follow along with that is that, you know, repositories, we're here to listen to what your needs are. And, you know, if you need links to other complementary data out in the world to your data sets, we'll harvest the the related data sets and use those DOIs, and we'll harvest your omics exceptions sitting in EDI or NCDI, and we'll link those to the data to help minimize that burden, but we're here to listen to how can we help your plight out.
I can also maybe add some personal experience from the Florida perspective. This Florida was a big business product that's very successful for the grocery data. Right now, data is being submitted by an email to me, which is again leads to, hey, please submit here, please submit there, and also to your email and whatever. For Florida, we now think of taking advantage of all the capabilities and using all this, scrape for their metadata and pretty much build a service, appropriate service that uses information on all this, access the data on the different repositories. So for example, if you submit the data to BPD or whatever, then you'll access the BPD data set, will have the additional metadata information that is machine readable, and so that machine readability can be automatically analyzed. That has to be looked at, but we're now thinking of doing that out, because for us it's not sustainable to have those also from our side. It's very difficult to say just provide the data to you, but super not sustainable. And also for spots, I'm thinking of going to say no. But for spots where for the pilot I had to approach it in the side, yes. But my idea is to, in my head, I just hope everybody is noticing it. We maybe support them becoming those nodes. That could happen to the data centers themselves. I mean, if you submit the data you can do, you are, it's not in that sense already. And then again, you could build a service for the time series community in similar fashion. If the data is properly regulated, properly mixed. There's of course then depending on the first place where you submit the data. If you submit the data to your repository where only minimal regulatory requirements set, then of course the usability of the data is also restricted. But if you, and give us a perfect example, they do this, they are adjacent, they are using JSON to provide the data. And if you have found such a place, and I would say you data can share, that's where we go to get ones that really count. It's not that we want you to count, just when you submit it, needs to be the problem. Which is not just on your, it's also on the repository.